Sarah had a fairly manageable pregnancy. There were just the usual amounts of nausea, heaviness, swelling, and irritability. She handled the separation from the man who could have been the father of her child quite calmly, even though he chose to quietly disappear without a trace. If he didn't want to be involved, that was fine. Her mother and friends all insisted that he should be held accountable. There were plenty of witnesses to their time together. Plus, if necessary, the paternity test would set everything straight. The baby was born strong, healthy, and active. The only hitch was that he was quite light-skinned, even a bit reddish. Her mother shrugged. Your grandfather was light-skinned, and who knows what kind of relatives your baby's father has? Her close friend Brittany gasped and exclaimed until Sarah asked with a smile, "So you're doubting? Maybe he's not mine?" After that, all questions were laid to rest. They named the baby Carl, rather than officially calling him our little ginger joy. Alice, a neighbor in the maternity ward, had a difficult labor, crying, screaming in pain, and moaning. Nevertheless, she gave birth at the same time as Sarah, and also had a boy. Sarah and Carl received the best care and attention, as Sarah's mother worked as the head of the department at that very maternity hospital. Sarah followed in her mother's footsteps and worked as a therapist at a city clinic. Gradually, the question of why Carl was so reddish stopped bothering Sarah, her mother, and her friends. Joy grew up healthy and developed ahead of schedule. Even though Sarah returned to work soon and hired a nanny, she personally monitored Carl's health and schedule strictly and attentively. Carl loved his mother very much, eagerly awaiting her return from work. He would throw himself around her neck with excitement, telling her all the new things he had learned that day. Nanny Amanda had a very important quality. She strictly followed all of Sarah's instructions without trying to interfere or introduce her own adjustments into the upbringing process. Sarah's mother, Grandma Molly, also happily spent time with the baby, treating him to pastries and waving her hands at Sarah. "Oh, come on, a little pastry won't hurt the baby." The women earned very well, were self-sufficient, intelligent, and in demand. None of them could even conceive of disrupting their peaceful, quiet happiness, either their own or the baby's, by focusing on their personal lives. That day at the clinic where Sarah worked, one of the nurses brought in a whole stack of old glossy magazines, some 5 or 7 years old. "What are these doing here, Kirby?" "Oh, Sarah, we don't need them. We've all read them long ago, but it's a shame to throw them away. They're so pretty. I thought they could stay on the tables. Patients will read them. It's more pleasant waiting in line." "All right then, let's put them out." The girl carried the stack of magazines and a few fell to the floor. "I'll pick them up, go ahead." Sarah waved her hand, bent down to pick them up, and suddenly realized that the photo on the cover of one of the magazines looked very familiar. It depicted a young, smiling couple. They were looking at each other with loving eyes and holding hands. For some reason, she was sure that she knew these people. The headline caught her eye: Alice and her ginger joy. The guy was indeed completely ginger. Sarah knew she had never met him before. Yet his face painfully reminded her of someone. She did remember the girl, though. It turned out to be the same neighbor from the maternity ward who had given birth so painfully. I wonder if this ginger guy is her husband, the baby's father? Or did they break up after they appeared on the magazine cover? If so, it's a pity. They were a beautiful couple. She kept the magazine and continued with her work, but for some reason she felt a strange unease in her heart. Soon after, she encountered Alice in person when they bumped into each other. In the lobby of the city hospital, where Sarah had come for work. The young woman was standing at the registration desk with a man, whom Sarah immediately recognized as the ginger guy from the magazine cover. Alice greeted her and noticed that Sarah looked quite distressed. "This is my husband Jason," she introduced the man, who also looked confused and distressed. "Our little boy is very sick with some hereditary genetic disorder. He's here in the hospital. We've been checked. Neither I nor my husband have anything. The doctors say this condition can be passed from parents, but might manifest through generations, even 2. Now we need to test all the grandparents, but not everyone is alive or nearby, and it costs a fortune. Alice, can I help in any way?" "I am a doctor, a therapist. It seems to me that instead of spending money on tests, it should be used for treatment. Thank you, Sarah. If needed, I'll call to consult. Let's exchange contact information. At that moment, Jason stepped away and she lowered her voice to add, "It's hardest for him. We're both healthy, but our son is terminally ill. He trusts me, doesn't suspect infidelity, but how long will that trust last, especially since Rick doesn't look like him at all?" Don't be so desperate, Alice. There are no incurable diseases these days. There are foreign clinics after all. I know, Alice interrupted her sadly. We might be saved by surgery done in Germany or Israel, but it costs so much that we could never save up for it in our lifetime. Sarah was stunned. Besides the usual sympathy for an acquaintance, the logical change troubled her. Alice and her husband were healthy people, yet their son had a genetic disorder. Alice's family had this disease, but Sarah and her mother had tested Carl. He didn't have it. Alice's son Rick didn't resemble his parents, and her Carl didn't resemble anyone. He was an inexplicably redhead. She didn't go to work, claiming to be unwell. She stopped by some peripheral cafe, ordered coffee and sandwiches. Could it really be that in our country, in the 21st century, such things as the scary plots from Indian soap operas and baby switching are possible? Could it be that in the maternity hospital where her mother works as the head of the department, the nurses could have made such a mistake? The place was supposed to be exemplary. After sitting at the table for a while, Sarah calmed down. She decided not to worry her mother for now and handle it herself, and she needed to take an important, albeit unpleasant step, undergo an anonymous DNA test, and then take action. Perhaps all these hypotheses and doubts were just a result of a nervous breakdown after hearing Alice's story, and everything would be fine with her. Of course, she would help the unfortunate woman in any way she could, but everything would be all right with Carl. Until she received the results of the DNA test, Sarah had been consumed by absurd thoughts and anxieties, so she arrived to collect the results feeling fraught and nervous. The results were issued at the clinic in a sealed envelope, personally handed over with a signature. She took the envelope, sat in the car, clasped her hands to still the trembling. Finally, she gathered her courage and ripped open the envelope. Until the last moment, she had hoped that all her fears were just a nervous breakdown, and that everything would turn out fine. But the impassive lines of the medical report were clear and unambiguous. Carl was not her son. It was a treacherous, devious blow to her entire life, her plans, her dreams. What happened? How could this happen? Why? What did she do to deserve this punishment? She didn't notice as she started the car and drove off. Everything done automatically. Her driving experience came into play. She passed several intersections on green lights, stopped at a red light, and suddenly the full picture emerged. Someone must have accidentally swapped the babies in the maternity hospital. Her Carl and Alice's son, Jason, had been switched. No wonder Jason had seemed so familiar. He was the father of her Carl, and Alice was his mother. This meant that in their family was growing up her own blood son, the unfortunate sick Rick, who had inherited the cursed genetic disease. At this realization, Sarah burst into tears, dropping her head onto the steering wheel, oblivious to the honking drivers, unaware of her surroundings. The driver's door opened, and a rather young man looked into the car. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked anxiously. "Is something wrong?" Sarah did not answer, only cried even harder. The stranger shook his head, glanced at the honking cars, and waved his hand, indicating that the situation was under control and that he would sort it out. He poked his head back into the cabin. "Let's move you to the passenger seat. I'll help you park the car. You can't drive in this state." Sarah quieted down and obediently moved to the front passenger seat. The man got into the driver's seat, turned on the hazard lights, and slowly drove to the sidewalk, found a parking spot, and pulled into it. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, motionless, staring blankly at one spot. "Are you sure you're okay? Are you healthy? Should I call an ambulance? Or should I call your husband or relatives?" "You can't be left alone in this state. Please, don't call anyone. I don't have a husband, and I don't want to worry my mother. Thank you for your help and sympathy. I'll sit here for a bit and then go home, and you'll crash into someone at the first intersection." The stranger smirked. "I suggest a different option. You tell me where you live, and I'll take you home." Do you really want to deal with me? Sarah shrugged. I do. Besides, it's my day off and I have the right to spend it as I wish. Thank you, but I can't go home right now. I need to pull myself together. If my mom sees me like this, she'll be devastated. All right, then we'll go to a cafe, sit for an hour, have some coffee, and talk. You'll feel better and be in better shape when you visit your mom. And by the way, my name is Dylan. Sarah, as you wish, Dylan. I'm just not myself right now. They pulled up to a cafe. Her new acquaintance parked the car and helped Sarah out. They took an inconspicuous corner table, and Dylan called the waiter over. I think you need to eat something, he said confidently. And have a shot of brandy. It's necessary right now. I'll drive the car anyway. Then you can tell me what happened. Maybe I can help. He confidently placed the order without asking Sarah anything, for which she was very grateful. She really wanted not to think about anything herself and to have someone strong and smiling solve her problems. So when Dylan asked her again what had happened, she silently handed him the DNA test results. That's a blow. He shook his head. So, the baby was swapped at the hospital? Or later? And let's switch to you. We're talking about such personal stuff and we're still like strangers. Swapped at the hospital immediately. When they brought him to me, I was surprised he was a redhead. But my mom reassured me. She said that Grandpa was light-skinned and the father's family could have had all sorts of traits, so I didn't worry about it. We even called Carl our little ginger joy. Sarah burst into tears again. Dylan moved closer, hugged her, and began to comfort her. You don't know the most important thing yet, Sarah sighed. I recently ran into an acquaintance who had a baby on the same day as me. Her husband is as red-haired as the sun, but their child doesn't look like him at all. We met at the hospital where their son, who was born at the same time as Carl, is staying. The diagnosis is a rare disease that is inherited from ancestors, but doesn't manifest in every generation. The mother told me it was present in the light-haired grandfather. He didn't live long, but he married and had children. His son, my grandfather, didn't have the disease. Neither did my mother or I. It seems it's only passed down the male line. I thought the disease had died out and wouldn't appear in my son, but it did, and my son is living with strangers. They love him, treat him, and care for him. Meanwhile, I love their son, healthy red-haired Carl. And Sarah began to cry again, but Dylan wouldn't let her give in. All right, enough. You came here to be in a normal state, but you're getting even more upset. Pull yourself together. The situation is terrible, but there are two big positives. What positives? The woman protested. Sarah, believe me, there are worse situations. First of all, you don't have to justify yourself to a husband who isn't here. And secondly, you know exactly where your biological son is now. That's true. Sarah looked at him in surprise. I completely overlooked that aspect. But still, she deflated again. He's growing up with strangers, loves them like his own. How can I now show up and prove that I am his real mother and give Carl to other people? Stop. Let's not get bogged down in details. The main task now is to save your biological son, Rick. You say he needs some complicated surgery? Complicated doesn't even begin to cover it. She sighed. It's done in Germany and Israel, and it costs so much money. I want to see if I can get into some sort of subsidy program or secure a quarter through my work. I'm a doctor, a therapist, if that helps. Wow, that's serious. Send me the diagnosis and other details and I'll check it out through my work as well. I'm an investigator in the police, so I might be able to help, he smiled. Alice curled up on the couch, hugging Leo, the fat striped cat that Rick loved, and which for some reason hadn't been allowed to stay with him in the hospital. She had barely managed to convince her son not to miss his friend too much. She would take care of Leo, and it would be more cheerful at home. When Rick recovered, she and Leo would come to pick him up. She smiled sadly as she thought about the cost of the surgery. They had a modest 2-room apartment in a not-so-prestigious neighborhood. Even if they sold it for the highest possible price, the money would barely cover the cost of the surgery itself. What about the flight? The accommodation? The medication? The rehabilitation period, which would require complete rest and constant examinations for the child. She would have to move between rental apartments, which might be hard to pay for. Their elderly parents on both sides might contribute occasionally, but they had no savings. Oh, Jason, my ginger happiness. It seems someone envied our love so much that they cursed our son. She looked at the framed photo on the wall and smiled, reminiscing about the past. She had come to the city from the province, staying with her aunt, a kind, lonely, cheerful, and busy homemaker. She had just finished school and moved to the city to pursue higher education. She devoted herself to her studies, but still found time for friendly gatherings without overindulging. However, in their third year, a guy with hair as red as the sun appeared in their group. He greeted everyone with a wide, joyful smile, and it felt as though the sun had entered the room, dispelling the dreary November slush. It immediately seemed that Jason and Alice were drawn to each other like magnetic poles. He walked her home, but she didn't get back until close to midnight, utterly astonished by a new, yet to be fully experienced feeling. All her previous crushes seemed like mere childish pranks in comparison. At the same time, Jason was remarkably delicate. They didn't even kiss that evening. They simply walked around the city, talking about everything under the sun. Within a week, they were considered a couple in their group. By their fourth year, when they decided to apply for marriage, it didn't surprise anyone. It was a bright spring day. The city had been washed by a warm rain in the morning. They filled out the necessary documents, stepped out onto the porch, and smiled as they watched the newlyweds leave, a newly married couple. The cheerful young photographer smiled at them as he passed by. And then, as the newlyweds were already settling into their car, he returned and said, "Guys, you make such a beautiful couple. May I take a picture of you for a magazine?" "Of course you can," they smiled. The guy took several shots, handed over his business card, and asked for their phone number. "What are your names?" "I'm Alice, and this is my ginger happiness." When they were planning the wedding celebration, they remembered the cheerful guy and decided to invite him as their photographer. They called him, introduced themselves, and he happily laughed. "Of course, I agree, and I'll have a surprise for you." They didn't pay much attention to his words, which was a mistake. In the middle of the festivities, Mark, as the photographer was called, asked for silence, formally congratulated the newlyweds, and presented glossy magazines as a gift, one copy each for them and their parents. The rest of the dozen he handed around with a request to look at them and return them. Naturally, no one returned them. Instead, they stuffed Mark with various beautiful banknotes while he pretended to be annoyed and handed out business cards. On the cover of the magazine was a photo with the caption, "Alice and her ginger happiness." It also stated that this picture was a winner of a city contest. Alice was so lost in warm memories that she didn't immediately realize that someone was ringing the doorbell. "Who's there?" she asked, surprised. "Alice, open up. It's Sarah, the therapist. Remember?" came the voice from behind the door. She opened the door and let Sarah and a tall, strong young man, whom she introduced as her best friend, inside. They followed the hostess into the room and took seats. "So Alice, don't worry and listen to me until the end. First of all, your son is completely healthy." "What? That can't be. We can't proceed with the surgery." "Alice, listen to me." Sarah made an effort. "Rick, who is lying in the hospital, is unfortunately also ill. But he is not your son." "How is that?" Alice interrupted again. "Listen, Alice." Dylan joined the conversation. "There has been a monstrous misunderstanding. Someone switched the babies at the maternity ward. You took Sarah's son who has this ailment from his great-grandfather, and Sarah was giving your boy who is perfectly healthy." "Where is he now?" Alice asked quietly. "He is at my home." "Look." Sarah opened the gallery on her smartphone, pushed it towards her interlocutor, and nervously swallowed, adding, "His name is Carl." Alice eagerly examined the photos, smiling through her tears. "Oh my God, oh my God. He looks just like Jason, exactly like him. That's why I noticed. I happened to come across a magazine." She nodded to the photo in the frame. "It was after our meeting at the hospital, and I couldn't understand why your husband seemed familiar. I had never seen him before. Then I came home and little Carl ran up to me. I looked at him and was just stunned. It's the same face." At that moment, the doorbell rang. "It's Jason." Alice cried joyfully and ran to open the door. A young man with an open, pleasant face, sprinkled with freckles and neatly combed red hair, entered the room. "What's going on here?" he asked, puzzled, seeing his tearful wife, the sobbing therapist Sarah, and a tall man who was likely his peer. "Oh, Jason, you won't believe this. We have something incredible," Alice cried out. "Something happened to Rick?" Jason exclaimed. "No, Jason, don't worry. Your son is fine. That is, nothing has changed. But he is my son," Sarah tried to explain and also burst into tears. Dylan approached the confused Jason, touched him on the shoulder. "Let's go to the kitchen, buddy. While our ladies cry it out, I'll explain everything to you without tears and emotions. Don't worry. The news is more good than bad." About half an hour later, after the women had cried it out and the men had talked, everyone gathered in the kitchen to work out a plan of action. Dylan, who by his profession and nature was immediately perceived as the leader, took the floor. "All right, guys, we are now practically relatives. So, let's drop the formalities and use first names. Our first and foremost task is to save Rick, and then we'll deal with the other issues. Remember, Rick is just as much our relative, and so we are involved equally with you. The amount needed for the operation is huge. Neither you nor we, as far as I understand, have 10 million stashed away. So, first, what real possibilities do we have? Second, how can we reduce the cost of the operation? So, on the first point, Jason, what resources do you have besides the apartment? We'll consider selling it as a last resort." "Well, we don't really have much." Jason shrugged. "We had some savings, but it all went on the current examinations and tests. My parents promised to help, but it'll be a small amount, if anything. I have a little stashed away, but not millions." Dylan shook his head. "I don't have any savings, but I'll talk to my mom. She doesn't know anything yet, but I think she'll help. She was saving up for my wedding. But for now we'll find something. Also, both she and I work in medicine. Maybe there are some programs or benefits available. I work in the police, so I'll look into that as well." They said their goodbyes as if they were close relatives, agreeing to call and message each other daily. They decided not to tell the boys anything for now. It was too complicated for them. Let them grow up first, then they'll find out. When Dylan was dropping Sarah off at home, she asked after a moment's hesitation, "Dylan, tell me this. For me, Rick turned out to be my biological son. The guys have raised and treated him since birth. He's just as much theirs. We are ready to sacrifice everything for him, but for you, Rick is a stranger. Well, not a relative at least. And you're ready to donate money and spend your time solving his and my problems. And as far as I know, your job isn't from 9 to 5 with weekends. Yes, you're right, my job is irregular. Because of it, I broke up with my fiancé, who couldn't handle the schedule. And there's no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow either. But I'm not talking about that. Many issues I can handle without leaving my office. Right now, Jason, Alice, and I will do everything possible. And they also have jobs. And you're not just lounging around. Sorry, I'm not good at making grand speeches, but I can't stay on the sidelines. You introduced me as a best friend, and now you're surprised that I'm sacrificing my time and money." "I'm sorry, Dylan," Sarah said regretfully. "I guess I'm out of touch with real friends, with selfless help, with a strong shoulder beside me. You can't imagine what your support means to me. That's why let's tackle the urgent issue of Rick's treatment first, and then we'll sort out the other matters." "Are you heading home now?" "Yes, I need to prepare for a conversation with my mom. It will be a big blow for her." "All right, and I have a favor to ask. When you talk to her, or later, ask her to recall what happened in the maternity ward during those days. Did she notice anything unusual? Any conversations, looks, or unfamiliar people? I still want to understand what happened back then and who might have been behind this crime. Nobody needed this, Dylan. It was just a nurse or a midwife who mixed up the babies. Maybe so, but don't forget my request. Of course, I won't forget." As usual, when Sarah entered the apartment, Carl ran to her, hugging her, kissing her, chattering about his little world. They hugged, chatted, and then Sarah went to change. Her mother came into the room and said discontentedly, "Did you want to talk to me about something?" "Yes, Mom. And you come home so late? It's almost time for bed. Were you with that cop again?" "Mom, don't call him that. He has a name, Dylan." "Yes, I was with him, but we're not doing anything improper." That's actually what I want to talk to you about. Oh, so your cop sorry Dylan has become a member of our family? Do we have some joint business with him and me? Yes, Mom, but let's talk about it later after I put Carl to bed. It's a very serious conversation. All right, Mom shrugged. Go ahead and have dinner for now. Sarah ate, discussed household matters with her mother, watched cartoons with Carl, put him to bed, and read the traditional bedtime story. It's a pity that Mom feels this way about Dylan. Maybe she thinks Sarah has found herself a fiancé and will leave Carl with her. I need to change her mind. Regardless of the situation, Carl will always be her beloved son. Finally, the boy fell asleep, softly snoring. Sarah turned off the lamp, lit the nightlight, and went to the kitchen to join her mother. What are you talking about, Sarah? Carl isn't your son? Is that what your beloved Dylan whispered to you? Have you been watching too many Mexican soap operas for something like this to happen in my department? A baby switch? He could have come up with something more original. Mom, please try to understand. The difficult conversation had been going on for almost half an hour, but not at all as planned. Her mother wouldn't move beyond her attacks on Dylan and had no desire to listen to her daughter's arguments. Here, look for yourself. These are Carl's real parents. See how much he looks like his father. And my son Rick is now in the hospital with an illness he inherited from your grandfather. He needs urgent surgery in Germany or Israel. Oh, I see now, and now I'm supposed to sell grandfather's apartment in the city to treat some Rick? Your policeman has played you well. He's introduced his relative, made up a pretty story, and you, fool, fell for it. You've turned your back on your own son Carl for a stranger? Your dear Dylan's relative? Mom, I'm not going to argue with you. Here, read this. She handed her mother the DNA test results. This can't be. How could you not believe me? Her hands trembled with the document, her eyes darting around. Then, with an immense effort, she composed herself. Take your paper, frame it, and hang it above your bed. Srat, don't even think about selling the apartment. I will go there and live there. I wanted what was best, but you stuck your nose where it didn't belong. Now do whatever you want, live however you want, and with whomever you want. Goodbye. The front door slammed, and Sarah buried her head in her hands and cried bitterly. A month passed before Sarah finally decided to tell Dylan everything, using general phrases and referring to her mother being away on a business trip. So it was actually her? Dylan shook his head thoughtfully. I'm sorry, I had suspicions from the start, but I didn't voice them. I really hoped I was wrong. But why? Why did she do this? Sarah asked for the umpteenth time. Unfortunately, I understand why. Gwen is a woman of position, respectable, exemplary. And then she suddenly has a genetically ill grandson. Specialists know that such a disease is definitely not a result of drunkenness or a wild lifestyle. But you can't stop people from gossiping. Rumors will spread. Both you and she will be dragged through the mud. As the saying goes, whether he stole the fur coat or had it stolen, something like that happened. Plus, dealing with a sick child is both expensive and troublesome. But here, look, a healthy, strong one. Born on the same day, lying there swaddled. Switching tags is a minute's work. Sent the nurse away under a pretext and voila, here's a healthy son. And the fact that he's a redhead, that's no problem. His grandfather was a redhead. It could also have come from the biological father. Sorry, Dylan realized. It's okay, Sarah forced a smile. I understand everything. What about Rick? How is he doing? She changed the subject. Here's the thing. I managed to get into a program that helps law enforcement personnel. I really put pressure on the boss and he was moved. Just sorry, I had to say that Rick is my son. Otherwise, nothing would have come of it. There will be no discount on the actual operation, but at least the travel and accommodation for the accompanying person will be covered by the host side. Plus, you, as a medical worker, will get some benefits, so you should go. You need to leave urgently, literally in a week or two. You know, I've been visiting Rick at the hospital for a long time, first with Alice, and then separately. He's become quite attached to me, and I think we'll manage the trip easily. Unfortunately, we don't have the full amount yet, but we need to leave. They're pushing us, and the deadlines are set. You'll have to go and start the treatment, and I'll stay here and think. As a last resort, we may have to sell Jason and Alice's apartment and have them move in with us. At that moment, a message alert from the bank pinged. Sarah opened it and gasped loudly. A transfer for an absolutely astronomical amount. The zeros seemed to dance before her eyes. There were so many of them. Dylan took the phone, read the message carefully, and sighed. Now we have enough money for everything. He paused and added, "It's from your mom." The letter accompanying the transfer simply said, "Forgive me." The operation was successful, and Rick began to recover rapidly. Dylan and Sarah got married and eagerly awaited the birth of their daughter. The boys, Carl and Rick, became close friends. They didn't worry at all about having two sets of parents each. They simply called them Dad Dylan, Dad Jason, Mom Sarah, and Mom Alice. Their communication with Gwen improved, and no one mentioned the past. She lived in a small apartment in the city, having traded her professor's mansion for it. She invited both grandsons to visit, promised to show them around the city, and treat them to pastries just like she used to do for little Carl. The broad-shouldered, red-haired Carl, who was already catching the eye of many girls in his class, was playfully teased by the refined intellectual Rick. He grumbled good-naturedly that the pastries should be saved for his little sister, who would soon be born. But everything was fine. He and his brother would definitely come to visit.